Welcome to our event this evening. Throughout 2020 to the present, there has been a growing movement nationally to address racial issues more directly and forcefully than at any time since the beginning of the 21st century. The conversation became increasingly impassioned as the country witnessed one incident after another in which Black Americans died due to the actions of the police or citizens who took the law into their own hands. This coincided with a terrible pandemic that has been more deadly to people of color in the US than the white population, clearly illustrating the health outcome disparities that have been recognized for many, many years. Higher education can and must confront these contemporary issues with a view toward their history and causes, and with this knowledge, we must consider possible steps forward to a more equitable and just society. Our college has a minor degree in health disparities, which I'm proud to say is the largest minor in the college. We have a robust degree in African American studies, and we have scholars throughout the college who focus their attention on matters of race and society. This webinar came from our desire to open up the access of the community to three outstanding scholars who will share their knowledge with us today. I'll introduce our panel in a moment, but first, some webinar housekeeping. Much of the program will be devoted to questions to the panel from attendees. To ask a question, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of the screen. Questions submitted in the chat will not be seen by the presenters or the moderator. We will work through questions that were pre-submitted and those that are asked during the event after the presentations are complete. We expect a large number of excellent questions, so we apologize if we are not able to get to yours. It is now my pleasure to welcome three distinguished liberal arts and sciences faculty members this evening. Dr. Della Mosley is an assistant professor in the psychology department. She created and leads the Wellness, Equity, Love, Liberation, and Sexuality Healing and Research Collective, and she is co-founder of Academics for Black Survival and Wellness. Dr. David Canton is the director of the African American Studies program and an associate professor of history. Following a national search in the previous year, he recently joined UF after teaching at Connecticut College since 2003. Dr. Lance Gravlee is an associate professor in the Department of Anthropology. His research focuses on the health effects of systemic racism, drawing on methods and theory from the social and biological sciences. Welcome to all of you. Let's begin with Della Mosley. Her presentation is entitled "A Plan for Preventing Racial Trauma." Della?
Thank you so much, Dean Richardson, for bringing us together for this important conversation. Thank you to Stephanie Bayer and Meredith Palmberg, who have just been really incredible to work with in getting us to this point of today's talk. I'm really excited to share space with you all here. Thank you for coming and being in community with us tonight. For those of you who I do not have the pleasure of knowing yet, I want to give you a little bit of background so you can understand how I come to this work. So my name is Della. I use the pronouns she, her, hers, and I'm a healer, scholar, and activist. The healer has 12 years of experience providing counseling primarily to Black and Brown students in settings from a middle and high school to a Job Corps center to Duke University and other university counseling centers. And so what I share today comes from my experience and the gift that I've been given of being able to hear from students intimately about their experiences with racial trauma and their exposure to racial trauma, as well as to hear their resiliency and joy as they persist in the face of it. The scholar studies racism and healing from racial trauma, system-level interventions to promote healing for queer and trans people of color. And actually, just last week, I learned that 2 of my articles that focus on race and healing were among the top read articles in the Journal of the Counseling Psychologist. And the activist is someone who uses her upbringing as a Black, queer, cisgender woman from a working class Midwestern home and as a healer and as a scholar to do something about oppression. That's Dr. Roderick Watt's definition of an activist, someone who does something about oppression. And so I hope that I am in conversation right now with activists or aspiring activists. So in 15 minutes, I can't teach you about racial trauma, let's be real, um, or offer a detailed plan to prevent it. Trust, I sincerely wish I could. But I have developed a model about how to become critically conscious about anti-Black racism. And so one of an incredible scholar in my lab, Sunshine Adam, is going to be dropping a couple links as I talk, including the first link is to this article, which I really encourage you to check out. I call it the woke to working model because it really talks you through how you can go from being woke or aware that anti-Black racism, the system of beliefs and practices that attack, erode, and limit the humanity of Black people, can be intervened, and how you can start to work against it, because it's not enough to be woke, we have to work. So there's 3 components, and in today's talk, you'll get to see a little bit of the first one, which is bearing witness to anti-Black racism. That involves witnessing and being able to name and notice anti-Blackness when it happens, as well as being able to name and notice racial trauma. And it ends in this step of being able to act critically against anti-Black racism. And so the second link that you'll see in that link tree is to a workbook. So my homework for you is at the end of this talk is, to be present here right now, but download that workbook, read this full article, and do the work of developing your own plan to prevent racial trauma. It takes time. It might take you a month to develop yours or more. That's the point. But this should get you started. So I really love Dr. Alan Pateers's framing of racism. It aligns with a lot of the ways that I write about racism in my work. He talks about it as a system of power, and that's what's super important to know. Racism is a system of power built on racial difference that restricts opportunity, profits on oppression, and justifies its actions by the false ideology of white superiority. I am intimately aware of racism in the way that he describes it. It aligns with many of the definitions that the students who not definitions, but the experiences and narratives that I've heard from students in my classes, participants in my research studies, and students definitely in my counseling chair. And as a result of that, I carry and live with a worry for our Black students. I carry and live with a worry, especially for those rare Black students with disabilities who made it to the University of Florida. Those students who are Black and queer who made it here, who are gender nonconforming and Black who made it here, who are the first in their family to pursue an undergraduate degree or a graduate degree and made it here. Those students who are children of immigrants, like those students who come from really low SES backgrounds. I know what it's like for them to navigate these spaces, and really from my work around this country, it's hard to navigate a number of historically white institutions. And so what I'm going to share today isn't new or novel, but it is important that you're able to name and bear witness to it. So I want to create space for students' voices to be amplified. And so this first video that I'm going to play, I want you to hold in mind this framing of racism, and I want you to listen for the products of racism. I want you to listen for how power is operating in this narrative. And in my multicultural psychology class that I teach, I encourage people to practice cultural mindfulness. And that's about, the first rule. I set a frame, you need to let go of the woke Olympics. We're not doing that here, right? That really gets in the way of doing the work of preventing racial trauma. It's not about getting it right. It's about trying, being present, being aware of yourself, showing up, persisting. And so that's what I want you to do. I want you to stay present, be aware of what's coming up, and reflect on that. Feel free to use the chat and make notes about what you're seeing or how you're reacting to it.
Hi, I'm Sunshine. I'm a graduate student at UF. I'm getting my master's degree in women and gender studies. I'm Black, I'm queer, I'm an immigrant, and I have invisible disabilities. I attended UF for my undergrad degree, and then now I'm here again for graduate school. And honestly, if I had to describe my experience at UF in one word, I think it'd be painful. It's not easy to be a Black student at UF. This week, I'm supposed to come up with my schedule for next semester, and honestly, that's such a stressful process for me. I feel like usually when you think of choosing your schedule, people will choose it based on what they're interested in. And for me right now, it's honestly what class can I take that will not give me a terrible experience during that semester? It's what class can I take that I feel safe in? So for instance, last year, a professor came to tell my class about a course that they'd be teaching in the future. And I asked them whether they'd be covering topics of race, and that just went so badly. They turned to me so annoyed, and they said no, right now there's a wave of people wanting to talk about Blackness, and that's just a trend that I'll not partake in. And they were just so hostile, and like as if that was the worst thing that I could have ever asked. And it happened in front of the whole class, and maybe to them that wasn't that big of a deal, but like to me that was violent. And that's just one of the many times that faculty explicitly told me that there's no room to talk about race in their curriculum. So in the end, I'm pretty much like always left to choose between anti-Black professors or professors that are well-intended and not actively harmful, but that don't really know how to intervene when a racist incident happens in their class. And also from my experience here, I learned very clearly that if you try to advocate for yourself, your needs or whatever, you're blacklisted. And if you ask for any type of change, they don't want you here no more. Like the school wanted my body for their diversity credit, but as soon as they found out that I'm like not the perfect, brilliant, pleasant Black person, and I'm just actually like a whole real human being with struggles and needs, then like they want me out. And I'm so painfully aware of how much I'm not wanted here. I keep hearing the school name drop like intersectionality, but I'm like, intersectionality where? Like, I'm not allowed to be Black and disabled here. Somebody, like, you can't be Black and queer. You can't be Black and loud. My first semester of grad school, I had to TA for a racist, transphobic, ableist professor, and I had to talk to her about my disability accommodations. And she literally told me that if I wasn't able to work as a regular graduate student, then I shouldn't have signed up for grad school. And then now, honestly, I'm kind of like, you know what? Maybe y'all are onto something. Should I even be here? Probably not. Because, like, yeah, right now, I do just want to get the fuck out of here. And this shit's happening to so many of us, and nobody takes it upon themselves to actually do something to help Black students. It's just always on us to just make it. I've gotten so close to dropping out, and like, if I had dropped out, that wouldn't be on me. That'd be on them, that'd be on y'all. As academics, faculty, staff, administration, y'all hold so much power. You literally have the power to shape Black futures. And we literally need your support. And honestly, I really don't fucking get why nobody's willing to go out of their way to do something.
Oof. So if you were taking notes, maybe you would note pain. I hope you'd note pain, lack of choice, anti-Black professors, tokenization, or being a diversity credit. I hope that you're reflecting on your positionality and your relationship to that story. So me as a professor, I'm tuned into when they're talking about their concern for other Black students, right? And so I'm thinking about what's my role in interrupting and intervening in the face of that, right? Why is another student who's a graduate student carrying this worry? And so that's the work that we need to do in order to prevent racial trauma. This highlighted question of how is power operating, that's the question we all need to learn. Like, just hold that in your mind at all times. How is power operating here? When you use that as your framework, you'll be able to much better prevent racial trauma because you'll be able to see it, you'll be able to name it, you'll be able to interrupt it in its tracks. In this narrative, you saw power operating in many ways, from trans negativity, from a professor, to Sunshine even articulating their experience here is a reclaiming of power and an experience of empowerment. But there are consequences. So right, like there's a reclaiming of power, but there's still consequences to experiences of anti-Black racism, and that's racial trauma. And racial trauma isn't just those experiences of racism that a person experiences in a classroom, or when we see or hear about police violence or the violence of white domestic terrorists, right? But it's also intergenerational, it's cumulative, it accrues over time, and we feel it in our bodies and spirits. And so one of the videos that's been dropped that I really hope that you'll check out is from Academics for Black Survival and Wellness, which was an initiative that a class doctoral candidate and brilliant student, Paris Bellamy, and I co-created with a bunch of other colleagues. And in this video that I'm sharing, Dr. Carlton Green goes into a lot of detail, really giving you some more information about how racial trauma plays out, what it looks like, how it manifests in physiological symptoms, emotional, behavioral, cognitive symptoms, things that you should be aware of no matter what your role is in the university or in the college. And so to prevent racial trauma, we have to be aware of it. And let's listen to another student who is aware of racial trauma and how they've navigated it here.
Hi, my name is Lanaya, and I'm a third year student here at UF. As a Black queer non-binary person from a low-income background. I had a lot of difficulty coming to a primarily white institute. I struggled finding a space for myself. I didn't see myself represented in any of the classes that I was taking or in this university itself. I started feeling overwhelmed, out of place, depressed, and genuinely let down. I fell behind in schoolwork. I lost a lot of motivation to do pretty much anything and seriously found myself needing a lot of help. I had been reluctant to go to the CWC because I had heard all the past horror stories from other Black and brown and queer folks and their experiences while they went there. But eventually I did after things had gotten to a point that they were out of my control. My resistance and hesitance to go to the CWC were completely justified after my triage appointment. I showed up, I went, and the woman who did my triage appointment did not make me feel welcomed. I don't even remember her name. It wasn't an inviting experience or an inviting space. She had me sit down, pour out my entire heart and soul of everything that was wrong with me, and didn't even signal that she was listening or that she cared while I was speaking. When I finally finished, I noted that I would have loved to have a Black woman or Black femme be my therapist, and I was immediately shut down when I stated that and was told that that wouldn't be an option for me there. And if that was the case, I would definitely need to seek help outside the CWC. She was pretty much ready to send me on my way after that until I asked for resources, and she did provide them, but none of those met my needs either. And it was genuinely disturbing that she had provided those resources to me and sent me on my way, knowing that they would not help me. And I felt like I wasn't even listened to and did not feel cared for whatsoever. So I left that appointment feeling worse than I did when I came in. I absolutely felt terrible. I felt like UF was not a place for me. It was not made for me or with me in mind. And I didn't know what to do. I felt lost. I felt like this wasn't for me and I was ready to leave. And so for me, I want UF to do better and provide more spaces where Black and brown and queer folks feel invited, feel welcome, feel like we're represented. I want the classes to represent us, and I want more of our representation to be in the coursework and the teachings that these professors are providing. I want more counselors in the CWC that understand our needs, understand where we're coming from, and make us feel welcome, make us feel like this is a space for us. I want more counselors that represent us. I want more counselors who are Black, brown, queer people who will get where we're coming from and know what we need in those moments. And I want UF to make us feel welcome and make us feel like we belong here and are wanted here.
So before I continue, there was some really great feedback coming that was only sent to panelists. So if you sent something previously, please share it with everyone. Some affirmations of Sunshine's narrative, and others were coming in. But in speaking to Lanaya's message, I just want to be clear, this is not an indictment of the CWC. There are some incredible Black psychologists working in the CWC. In fact, a great group for Black women that's led by Dr. Annalisa Clark that stays full and is overfull all the time. But this is about amplifying students' real experiences, and Black students report struggling to access support. It's about gaining an understanding that anti-Black racism gets multiplied by a lack of emotional support in the face of racial trauma and results in students who are paying their fees and who should be able to have the full experience here, experiencing a healthcare inequity here, right? And so we need to prevent racial trauma. We need more mental health professionals who are able to assess, treat, and meaningfully resource our Black students and other BIPOC who are contending with racial trauma. We need faculty who can see, hear, and recognize racial trauma and resource students in the face of that. And we need to think about system level interventions, right? So that this isn't a narrative that was passed down to Lanaya as a freshman about not being able to access support. Like having a continued narrative of not having support for Black students is not okay. We're overdue for a plan to prevent racial trauma. And we need more people to get it right now. And there are pathways available to you to grow in your ability to prevent racial trauma. And it does take some risks, but it's worth it. And some people are already taking those risks, right? Like you see on the top left, a snapshot from an article in the Chronicle of Higher Ed where some faculty are advocating around the safety of students and the campus in the context of returning to campus next semester. The top right, you see Dream Defenders advocating on campus. At the bottom left, it's an image of a flyer that there are Black graduate students, Garrett Ross and Milan Savori Rayford, class students, psychology students who are providing a support group for Black graduate students. In the bottom right, you see a flyer of a resource that was created by doctoral students in order to support undergrad students who are struggling in unsupportive environments. And I know there's so many of my faculty colleagues who are fighting, who are doing all of this work to help enhance Black survival and wellness, right? But there's not enough of us. And there's some of you who are working and helping the students in your classes, or you're helping your peers if there are students on here perhaps, but it can't just be this one-off support that those people in your circle or network get that support, but we need to think systemically and sustainably about how we prevent racial trauma. Because Black folks are worthy of wellness. And I'm talking to y'all right now. You are worthy of being advocated for. You are worthy of visibility. You are worthy of respect. You are worthy of having your voices heard. You are worthy of seeing yourself represented in coursework, not being erased from the syllabi. You are worthy of mental health care. You are worthy of support. You are worthy of breath. You are worthy of having more accomplices. You are worthy of an institutional shift towards your wellness. You are worthy. Please drop in the chat what else Black folks are worthy of, because clearly we don't hear it enough. And it makes me wonder if the reason that we haven't facilitated Black wellness and survival yet is because we don't believe Black folks are worthy of wellness, or we're not able to imagine it. And if it's the latter, we don't have to imagine it. You don't have to be on your own coming up with a plan to prevent racial trauma. There are a lot of folks around this campus, and you just heard Lanaya and Sunshine articulating what they need. And here you see some asks from the UF Black effort, folks saying, hey, we need better consideration for UF's frontline in custodial services who don't have name badges or safe spaces to take breaks. We need, revisions to syllabi. We need equitable pay for Black graduate students, right? Clearly articulating what wellness and the prevention of racial trauma would look like for them. And so let's show up for them. In order to prevent racial trauma, we have to develop a plan. We have to be intentional about it. We have to collectivize on it. We all have to have a role in it. Are you willing to get to work? Thank you.
Thank you, Della, for that powerful message. Please submit your questions in the Q&A box for Della. I'm now pleased to welcome Dr. David Canton with his presentation on African American Studies, a discipline designed to deconstruct racism and construct social justice. David. David, can you unmute yourself, please?
I got it. I'm sorry about that. I should know better by now. Before I begin, I'd like to thank Dean Richardson. I'd like to thank my colleagues, Dr. Mosley, Dr. Gravlee, Meredith, Stephanie, for the work that they do. I'd also like to give a shout out to the members of Omega Psi Phi Fraternity Incorporated. It's our 109th anniversary this evening, and I'd like to begin. So, African American Studies, a discipline designed to deconstruct racism and construct social justice. Hold on, there we go. So I'm part of what I say the Black Studies generation. I was born June 17th, 1968. This 2 months after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King. And we see from the first slide, we know there were rebellions all across the country. And we also know there was discussions about the development of Black studies as a discipline in the university. We know in the early 60s, the Student for Democratic Society viewed universities as purveyors of maintaining the military-industrial complex, where public universities, where scholars would do research on nuclear weapons and other ways to maintain the American empire. So we also know that with the development of Black studies is that the curriculum in higher ed was Eurocentric. So as a historian, historians provides the answers to these questions. So we saw our previous presentation. So the question is why and how? Why do these systems of inequality persist? It's like we're like Groundhog Day, right? We're constantly waking up to the same thing all over again, called what? Institutional racism. So we see in 1968, we have Dr. King's assassinated, we have the rebellions, and again, in a long history of America, is only when Black death, Black violence, there becomes a response to make structural change. That is problematic. But nevertheless, 1968, Black Studies is created at San Francisco State University, becomes a department because we know departments provide tenure. And what we know in higher education, tenure is the key to life. Tenure provides faculty members the power to make decisions, to make institutional change, to mentor students, to protect students, to disagree with colleagues who may be hostile to African American students. Years later, Rodney King, April 1992, as we see again, violent death, beaten by police officers, even on video camera, not guilty. I was at Ohio State when that occurred, and guess what happened? There was student protest at Ohio State in Columbus, Ohio in 1992. Months later, Bill Clinton's elected president, and then the whole thing of multiculturalism becomes part of the discourse. At Ohio State, guess what? Demands more Black students, more Black programming, more Black counseling, the same exact rhetoric one heard in 2020. Now, Black studies by then been around for 24 years. Well, I'm getting old, 24 years. So already inherent in Black studies were addressing these issues. But because of lack of funding from major universities, because of lacking funding from private foundations, Black studies had to struggle its way through from 68 to 92. So in other words, if it was practiced like how it should have been from the beginning, when Rodney King and these issues came around, they would have been already discussed. We saw after Rodney King, 92, again, another rebellion, billions of dollars damaged in that time, right? We also know a year before that, Latasha Harlins was a Black woman who was murdered in a candy store by an Asian American woman who got probation and community service, which adds to the further tension. We also know with the Rodney King decision 3 years later, we have OJ. What many people say he's guilty, but the argument was Black people saying the justice system was not just. Next, we have George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, 2020, and here we go again, right? Both George Floyd was murdered by a police officer. Breonna Taylor killed. Was still going through this. She got a settlement, but still being a debate. So now we see protest again for the same things that are protested in 1968. So do we see the pattern, right? We don't see a pattern where institutions decide to, you know what, we're doing something wrong. Let's make it right. It's always in reaction to an egregious a Black body or death or something violent, right? That's what it takes. So that's why people say Black Lives Matter. Why does it take King's assassination, the beating of Rodney King, these deaths for people? Wow, there's racism. I didn't know that. I thought things were better. There's a Black president. There's Oprah. There's Spike Lee, right? There's Issa Rae. So let's look at African studies in the ivory tower. So we view institutions, higher education, right? We know that people say we need to get an education, but unfortunately in this country, education has been commodified. So it's about, or really now vocationalized, just to get a job. So what does that mean? Certain knowledge has been privileged forever, right? Western universities based on Eurocentric knowledge says what? Western Civ is quote unquote universal, and this is the knowledge one needs to be successful. And we all know when you get a job interview, nobody asks you about Homer, Cicero. They don't ask you to read it in Latin, right? It's about skills. But unfortunately, in our structure, we devalue non-white knowledge. There was a few years ago, there was a rumor that if you bought Beethoven, Western classical music, kids will be smarter. That's just made up. That's nonsense. That doesn't make any sense. But that's the legacy of a Eurocentric education, right? Classical music, European classical, it's African, it's Indian classical music. So we have San Francisco State, 1968. There was a student strike, student demonstrations. We know that's historical. When young people organize, when young people demonstrate, institutions change. And that's whether it's Tiananmen Square or across this country, young people, SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. This is why history is important. When young people vote, 18 to 29, things change. This is all due to a knowledge of history, okay? 1987, Temple University starts the first PhD program in African American studies. 1987, Temple University, North Philadelphia, public university, not a highly ranked, relatively speaking, but nevertheless, Molefi Asante, his original birth name, government name was Arthur Smith. He was born in Georgia. The story was when he went to Ghana to look at his first book and he told the white guy, I'm Arthur Smith, the African, I'm Arthur Smith. He said, Arthur Smith, we thought you were British. So that's this whole thing of name changing, wearing African dashikis, looking at the impact of culture. So his first book, Afrocentricity, and the bottom line is this, looking at information from an African-centered perspective. Now, for some people, it's simplistic, right? When we say philosophy, Western philosophy, because we know in West philosophy, you're studying Western philosophers, but they're African philosophers. When you say classical music, there's Western classical music. Doesn't mean African classical music is better. It recognizes African classical music. There's African philosophy. So this whole notion of multiculturalism is that there's no Olympics of culture. There's no culture that's better than the other. This isn't ranking fast foods. So his argument is, let's have an Afrocentric program, and then we have a PhD program. Then with the next few years, PhD programs start to take off. But we also know in the early 90s, with the rise of affirmative action, we see an increase of Black PhDs, okay? So we know in 1968, right, when you have the first round of Black studies, we have an increase of Black students going to universities. We also know by the 90s and 2000 with affirmative action programs, they found a pipeline. There weren't enough African Americans in the pipeline. So we have programs like the Ronald McNair Scholars Program, 1986. We have the Mellon Mays Undergraduate Program, 1989. So we see in the last 30 years an increase of Black PhDs as a response to the lack of role models in universities, right? We know mentoring, because for a long time, people thought, wow, white students must be brilliant. No, they had mentoring. They had a system that rewarded, that built confidence, that justified their humanity and existence. That helps you write a paper, and of course, some networks. So what these programs do is they replicate that. As we increase the pipeline, as we get more Black faculty on these campuses, they provide, like people say, a mentor, someone that can share a story, because one can have an intellectual connection, but experience is a good teacher. I think there's a song, experience is a good teacher. So therefore, when students come to see these Black faculty, whether they're first gen, second gen, from the South, from the North, that they share these stories. And it's those stories that gets people through the tough times. So next we have between 2008 and 2017, we had 999 PhDs to 1,207. Okay, so there's been a steady increase in the number of Black PhDs. So the notion that we can't find any is a lie. That argument is dead in the water. We know most teach at HBCUs, which are teaching schools, that becomes the issue. But the reality is, even for Blacks with PhDs in STEMs, still have a hard time finding employment. So that's something about the structure that we're talking about. So as a historian, I look at the structure of inequality over time, right? Rather than blame individuals. I mean, President Obama, again, yes, he did a great 8 years, but in his recent comment about Ice Cube, allegedly Black guys want to, they admire Trump because of breaking the law or being gangster. No, it's a system, right? A system of racism. So for us as a historian, we use history not to live in the past, but to explain societal trends. So my last point is this. We know in November 7th, Kamala Harris, the first Black woman of color vice president, and Joe Biden, the president, won the election. And people were crying, they were feeling good, and I was too, but I had that same feeling in 2008. And what happened? In 2010, guess what happened? Tea Party. So what does that tell me as a historian? in the history of this nation, right? We're talking about Joe Biden must unify. As a historian, it doesn't add up. After Reconstruction, white rage. After the Black freedom struggle, white rage. So in other words, in 2020, as a historian, I don't see that. You can call me cynical, call me mean, call me not optimistic, but history is not kind, it's history, which means what? We study human beings, which means what? There's good and there's bad, there's nuance, complexity. History is not kind, it's history. What people want to say history as is just a morality play of American exceptionalism and liberalism and all this other stuff. Look how we can make up. How can you make up when you had a party that intentionally created policies to voter suppression? It doesn't make sense as a historian, right? Anything else said is just ahistorical. And I don't care if Joe Scarborough is on TV. Just because you're on TV, you're not a historian. So this is why I'm so passionate about history, because we don't do a good job in this country teaching about history. And that's why we have these conversations every single year. So I encourage students to really, history is not just facts and dates. That's one of the biggest mistakes. That's why you hated it in high school. I don't give dates. I forget half the dates. I'm getting older. You see what I mean? But it's about change over time. It's about nuance. It's about complexity. And it's about human beings struggle with themselves, power of oppression, complicity, right? All these things. So what I encourage my students to do when you're in my class, stop trying to be the unicorn. Well, I would have been Nat Turner. No, you wouldn't. I would have been John Brown. You wish. I'd have been Ida B. Wells out there. No, you wouldn't. Most people want to be those things, but the reality of family, fear, death is a reality. That's why history is so important. So once you understand history, you can engage systems better. There's less shock and surprise, right? There's more, it helps you prepare better for the future, okay? So my last point, what is history? You have a glass of water, half is in there. Is it half empty or half full? Who's right or wrong? How you take your evidence and use that to state your case. I don't believe in objectivity. We have perspective backed by evidence. If you read the New York Times, you know which way it goes. You read the Washington Times, you know which way it goes. So this whole notion of objectivity is not true. Supreme Court judges interpret the law from a perspective. I mean, let's just be honest. So as a historian, I have a particular perspective, right? Guided by evidence, based on experiences. African male from the Bronx, first generation. I'm 6'7", went to Morehouse, I'm a Q. All those things shape my perspective. And that's the power of history. And I hope if you have questions about the major in history, please feel free to ask, put it in the chat. I can go for another 3 hours, but I won't, because I know we have other people to speak. Thank you.
Thank you, David. We look forward to hearing more from all of our panelists during the question and answer session. So please be sure to put your questions down in the Q&A. Now, will you please welcome Dr. Lance Gravlee to discuss dismantling racism on campus and beyond. Lance?
Well, thank you, Dean Richardson. And I'd like to also express my thanks to the staff in the college office, Stephanie Baer and Meredith Palmberg, who've done a lot of work behind the scenes to make this event happen, and I'm very grateful. I also want to extend my thanks and just acknowledgement of respect to my colleagues, Dr. Della, Dr. Canton, and especially to Sunshine and Lanaya for their courage to share with us their stories and experiences. I really hope that if nothing else from tonight, that we all take away the experience of witnessing what they shared with us. And if you've been paying attention to the chat, some of which I know only the panelists can see, but some of which all of you see, you know that Sunshine and Lanaya's stories might be unique to their own circumstances, but they're not isolated. We're seeing a lot of affirmation from other students at UF and alumni from UF who are testifying to their experiences here. And my hope is that all of us, and especially people who are in positions of power, are listening to those stories and feel mobilized to act. So I'd like to frame my comments tonight, beginning with, let's see, I'm having a little difficulty getting the slides to advance. I might need a hand from you, Stephanie. Here we go. So some of you may have seen in June, the New Yorker magazine devoted its cover to this image, which was illustrated by Kadir Nelson. It's titled, "Say Their Names." And it's a powerful but painful reminder of the long history of racialized violence that Dr. Canton just referred to, a history of violence that shortens the lives of Black people in this country. The image beckons us to recite the names of Trayvon Martin and Michael Brown and Eric Garner and Freddie Gray and Sandra Bland and the Charleston Nine and Alton Sterling and Philando Castile and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and George Floyd and a shameful number of others, for the purpose of reclaiming their humanity and acknowledging the value of their lives. And as Dr. Canton suggested, it should not take this level of violence for us to acknowledge it. It comes at a time when George Floyd's dying words and Eric Garner's take on new layers of meaning. Hundreds of thousands of Americans have struggled to breathe because of a novel coronavirus that causes COVID-19. And like other pandemics before it, COVID has tracked the fault lines of society, taking a disproportionate toll, especially on Black and Indigenous communities. According to the latest data from the APM Research Lab, 1 in 875 Black people in the United States has died from COVID-19. And 1 in 925 Indigenous Americans has died from it. Now, the reality is that many more white Americans have died from COVID-19 in absolute numbers, but the death rate among white people is less than half of that for Black or Indigenous people. In fact, if death rates were the same for Black people as they are for white people, more than 21,000 mothers and fathers and sisters and brothers would still be alive. Now, these intersecting crises didn't just happen to coincide. They're actually deeply intertwined. Both of them reflect forms of violence, one fast, one slow, rooted in centuries of state-sanctioned racialized oppression. Each of these crises exacerbates the other, and both have been met with struggle and resistance, leading to what many commentators have described as a national reckoning with racism. Now, this reckoning is long overdue, and it's unquestionably a good thing. It's part of what led us to be together in conversation tonight. But the question still remains, what will come of it? Now, early evidence suggests that the impact is likely to be uneven. I'm showing you here results from a recent poll and analysis conducted by the Pew Research Center. And it shows that large numbers of Americans have been paying attention to questions of racial injustice, but it's very uneven depending on where people are positioned in a system of racial oppression. This poll, which was conducted in September of this year, shows that about 2/3 of people who identify as Black have been paying a lot of attention to issues of race and racial inequality in the last several months, that they've done something to educate themselves about the history of racial inequality, and that they've made an effort to support minority-owned businesses. But notice that for people who identify as white, as Hispanic, as Asian, we still have less than half of people who are reporting that they're paying attention to these issues and that they're doing something about it. Moreover, if you actually look at data from public opinion polls after the summer of racial reckoning and compare it to a year ago, you see that actually for most white Americans, nothing substantial has changed. Reading lists have proliferated. People have come out to protest. But what the image I'm showing you here suggests is that about 4 out of 10 people who identify as white say that the country hasn't gone far enough in securing equal rights for Black people in our country. But about 4 in 10 also say it's been about right, that we've done enough. And this summer of racial reckoning hasn't been enough to budge that proportion of white people who aren't called to action to transform our society. So what I'd like to suggest is that we reframe this discussion about the national reckoning of racism and think, how can we go from a reckoning with racism to dismantling racism? How can we take action to undo this system? Now, I was going to talk a little bit about what anti-Black racism is, but I don't feel like I need to say much more because Dr. Della and Dr. Canton have both expressed it eloquently. But I do want to put it into conversation with what we know about the way most people interpret racism. And part of the problem that we're up against is that most people, and especially white folks, think that racism is a matter of individual hearts and minds. Again, this poll from the Pew Research Center, which was conducted in 2016, suggests that 70% of white people understood racism to be primarily a problem of the prejudice of individuals. Less than 20% of white folks understood it as a system that's built into our laws and institutions. So this is part of what we're up against. If we want to go beyond reckoning with racism, if we want to go beyond reading lists and self-education, we have to recognize the ways that racism is built into systems, and we have to be willing to dismantle those systems. We have to be willing to change them. Now, a former member of our college, sociologist Joe Fagan, now at Texas A&M, is one of many social scientists who have articulated a theory of systemic racism. We could trace it also back to the work of Kwame Ture and Charles Hamilton in their book Black Power, which introduced the distinction between institutional and interpersonal racism. And the point is that we have to understand racism not as a matter of individual hearts and minds, but rather as the material, social and ideological reality that is embedded in major institutions. The consequence of this perspective is that we could get rid of all the racists. We could get rid of all of the bigotry and the prejudice, but that would not be the end of racism. That would not be the end of racial inequities that are the consequence of centuries of systemic oppression. Now, we're here, members of a university community, and we face the particular challenge of how do we address systemic racism when we are part of the system in question? And for me, listening especially to the experiences of Sunshine and Lanaya, their experiences as students here at the university reminds us that the University of Florida, along with other predominantly white institutions in higher education, are part of the problem. So how do we think about transforming racism by transforming ourselves? Well, there have been a lot of responses to that. Early in the summer, an alumna of the University of Florida started circulating a petition that a course that I teach and co-developed with Lizzie Barola, a graduate student, PhD candidate in the Department of Anthropology, Race and Racism, be a required course for all students. Now, as you can see here, more than 26,000 people signed on to this idea, which suggests a lot of goodwill that we ought to be able to capitalize on. And you might expect that because I teach this course, I think it would be a good idea for it to be required, but I don't. And there are a lot of reasons why I don't. But the main one that I want to emphasize today is that we have to match systemic problems with systemic solutions. And mandating a class or mandating diversity training has the appearance of being a solution, and it runs the risk of actually letting the institution off the hook. We actually have to demand much more. We have to recognize the depth of the history, the depth of the inequalities, and confront it there. So what are some ways that that plays out? I'm hoping that you have some ideas and can drop it in the chat, and that we can talk about it more. But just a few things to get us thinking. You know, the University of Florida is a land grant university. You've probably heard this phrase. Have you stopped to think about from whom was the land granted? Well, in 1862, the Morrill Act gave 79,461 parcels of indigenous land totaling 10.7 acres to 52 land grant universities to fund their endowments, and the University of Florida was one of those. Now, this was not just the land that the universities were built on, it's land that the universities were built with. Often the land that was granted wasn't even where the campus was located, but it was real estate that funded the endowment of universities. And one recent analysis suggested that these lands overall had a value of about $500 million. So at our very roots, the University of Florida, like many other universities, is founded on white supremacy that depends on the dispossession of land from indigenous people and the enslaved labor of African people and their descendants. So we have to start with that history before we can really act. And then you can connect that history to what's happening in our community right now. This is a recent piece in the Gainesville Sun. It's actually for The Guardian. And you see here a community organizer, I hope many of you know and are following her work, Faye Williams, from the Porter's Quarters community, addressing the role of the university in gentrification, in the development and persistence of wealth inequalities right here in our community. The Black communities close to the University of Florida face threats from the development from the university. We play an active role in driving the social and economic inequalities that result in the kinds of disparities that get our attention when they flare up. But these are the fundamental issues that we need to be thinking about. Beyond our campus, what is our role in shaping racial inequity in our society? Gainesville, according to analysis from the University of Toronto, Gainesville is actually in the top 10 economically segregated metropolitan areas in the entire United States. The only way we could make ourselves feel slightly good about that is if the number one is Tallahassee. And we like to joke about Tallahassee, but what we really ought to recognize is that what these have in common is that these are college towns. And in fact, if you look at that top 10, college towns dominate some of the most economically and racially segregated communities in the country. And we need to be thinking about what role does the university play in driving that, and how can we challenge the university to do better? We could also think about the relationship between the university and the use of prison labor. We can draw a straight line from the history of enslaved peoples being exploited for their labor to the present moment. The good news is that thanks to the action of students who have been pressing on this issue, that the university has pledged to stop using prison labor in its agricultural operations, and it will be up to the rest of us to ensure that the university fulfills this commitment. We should also be talking about the systemic inequalities that result in inequities in access to a University of Florida education. All of these data about the racial composition of UF students are available publicly on the UF website. You can go there and explore it yourself. This is just a snapshot of it. It reminds us that less than 7% of UF students identify as Black in a state where Black people are 15% of the population. And what's more troubling is that if you look at the trends over time, that the proportion of Black students at UF has been steadily on the decline. How well do we understand why that is happening? It seems easier to understand after you listen to Sunshine and Lanaya and those who have chimed in the chat. How much of a priority is this for the university? What things can we do as professors, as administrators, in changing the admissions process? One of the asks that Dr. Della shared earlier was removing the SAT and the GRE from admissions, which are tests that are fundamentally rooted in eugenics thinking, right? We need to understand that history and the role that they play in maintaining inequality now. And of course, we could talk about pipeline issues as Dr. Canton raised. We could play it forward to questions about the faculty. So the situation for the faculty is even worse if you focus on the workforce at the university as a whole. On the face of it, it doesn't look so bad because of the dynamic that Dr. Della raised of who are the frontline workers that actually keep the university open, right? If you look at the faculty, more than 2/3 of the faculty are white, like me. Only 4% of the faculty identify as Black. And what that means is, as of these data, this is from fall of 2019, in a faculty of almost 6,000 people, there were 238 people who identified as Black. At the level of full professors, it's 16, right? So obviously the problems that we're facing here go beyond the University of Florida. These are systemic issues in higher education as a whole. They reflect much broader inequities in our society. But what can we as a university do to change it here? And what things have we done here that have kept us from fulfilling the promise of racial equity right here on campus as well? So I want to leave you just with an image of George Stark, September 15th, 1958. This was his first day of classes at UF. This is just 62 years ago. So we could talk about the summer of racial reckoning, but we need to understand that in the broad scope of things, even the idea that Black people could be on our campus as students happened in historical terms practically yesterday. We're dealing with a deep history, deep inequities. And I invite all of you to join in conversation, share your ideas about what things we can do to dismantle racism on our campus, but also in the broader society. Thanks.
Thank you, Lance. That translates us from the panel remarks to the question and answer period. And so at this time, I'd like to ask all of the panelists to unmute and come back to the screen so we can all be together. I'm going to begin today with a few questions which came in prior to the event from attendees. And I'm going to offer this first question up to Della, but encourage the other members of the panel to chime in if they wish. What is the most effective step that students can take on campus or even in their own college lives to be actively anti-racist?
Thank you for that. And I just have to say, thank you, Lance and David. Y'all snapped. Those are dope presentations. Really honored to be in community with you. I think that students need to get to know their own racial identity. That's the most important work. I mean, people associate identity development with college, identity exploration with college, but if you're not doing some deep exploration around what your race is, what your racial identity is, where you are, there are really dope models, especially like if you're a white person, check out Dr. Janet Helm's incredible racial identity development models, right? Understand like there's a process and journey, and so get to know yourself deeply, know how you're positioned to privilege, know how you might be complicit in different oppressions, learn about intersectionality in a deep way, in a real way, right? I think that self-work is going to be super important and ongoing, but that really important to self-understanding.
Thanks.
Also, when I was in college, Willie Ricks, Mukasa, he was behind Black Power. I was younger, I wanted to protest all the time. He said, brother, you need to start a reading group. Reading group? I want to tear something up. But you got to do study groups. I mean, obviously, Robin Kelly wrote a good article about universities, the way they're set up. If they were set up for radical justice, we'd have healthcare. We wouldn't be having these discussions. So therefore, use the study group where you get an actual book, not just a Huffington Post ad, and you read a chapter and engage, and it's wide open. You can read Marxism, you can read social, you can read whatever you want to read, and use study groups as a way to educate and inform and become this change agent. So you're not just waiting on the class or the professor used this time to use study groups. Now, as I get older, I see what that meant. When I was young, I didn't want to hear that. I want to get a sign and protest, run out, which is not bad, but a reading group, a study group is more radical than you think.
Vance?
Yeah, I really would like to especially lift up what Dr. Della was saying about getting to know who you are in terms of your racial identity and where you are positioned. I think this is especially a challenge for white students who might arrive here on campus never having really thought of themselves as even having a race, right? So it's kind of a radical concept for many white people to become conscious of the role that race plays in their lives. I have often students in my race and racism class, white students who, you know, I have them do a digital storytelling project that asks them to reflect on the role that race and racism has played in their lives. And a lot of white students get stumped because they're not used to thinking about that. So I think until you have that kind of awareness, it's really difficult to think about ways that you can start to counteract it and develop a healthy identity as a white person.
Thank you. Thank you all. Next question is going to go to David. Again, everyone else feel free to chime in. So David, you talked about the history of racism and the very, very huge explosions and the small explosions and everything that happened in the history of race in this country, and up to the year we are in right now. But consider someone who does not believe that racism is a dire situation in our country. Could be a student, could even be a faculty member, could be someone in the community. How would you talk to them about racism and anti-racism?
That's a great question. And I think numbers and data speak. I think oftentimes it's about history and humanities that we're anti-data. And the reality is I use the numbers. So I'm going to read from Dr. King's Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community. His last book, 1967. And by that time, he's the most hated man in America before he was assassinated. So, right? We said that racism, people believe it's prejudice, feelings, Gunnar Myrdal, American Dilemma, some sort of white crises. It's a system. So Myrdal's book served the foundation from the 40s to the Civil Rights Movement till Black Power. But here goes King. Of the good things in life, he has approximately 1/2 those of whites. Of the bad, he has twice those of whites. Thus, half of all Negroes live in substandard housing, and Negroes have half the income of whites. When we turn to the negative experiences of life, the Negro has a double share. There are twice as many unemployed. The rate of infant mortality among Negroes is double that of whites. And guess what? It's still the same today. Regardless of class, Black middle-class babies are dying. And it's not about eating pork grinds and drinking Kool-Aid and all that blame the victim nonsense. Racism's a public health. Home ownership, white home ownership, good things, 72%. Black home ownership, 41%. So that's how I explain. These are systemic, but we like to believe it's something with Black behavior, and Blacks need behavior modification that even some neoliberals say that nonsense. Just change your behavior, pull up your pants, stop listening to hip hop, stop getting tattoos. It doesn't matter. The police don't do a respectability test. It's the system. So here's this book in 1967, and we have the same stats. That's the frustration. That's racism. And if you talk to blame the stuff, I'm done with all that. And I don't care about your cousin, the anecdotal stuff. I'm done with that. You know, I hit them with the stats. And that's how you got to do it. And the books are there, it's out there. So there it is. Anything good, we get twice less. Anything horrible, we get twice more. And that's systemic. Yes, there's been progress, but those systems. And the last point, I'm sorry, Michael Harriot wrote a piece in the group basically saying, you know, anytime when Black people move forward, there's no evidence of white people moving back. Reconstruction helped white people. Right. So rights movement help white people. Affirmative action help white women. There's no data that says if you provide policing, a Black economic agenda, support HBCUs, there'll be no impact on white people. They would improve. There's no evidence. Look it up. But we don't use data. We use anecdotes, right? Oprah, Spike, Samuel Jackson, he's cussing, a few Black professors. Black people have made it. it's more complicated. These are systems. So hopefully from this talk, we focus on systems, and what can we do in our role? Recognize our complicity. We're all working on something, and how do we move forward? And let's move away from blame the victim and behavior modification. That's, that's another discussion, but that's where I'm at with that. So there you go.
Thank you, David. Della or Lance?
Yeah, I would just add, those are some great points. Speaking again, kind of to Black folks and other, Black, Indigenous, folks of color, right? Like this question of how do you explain racism to someone who doesn't believe that it's real? You don't have to engage in that either. Like that is not your job to do. So you can also decide, like that's part of white supremacy and how it maintains itself, is allowing you to get caught up in or wrapped up in having the same argument over and over again, right? Like I center my work on healing from racial trauma, prevention, and like Dave said, focusing on like system level interventions, like that's where we need to put our energy. So so protect yourself, protect your energy. Sometimes you might just want to like school somebody cool, but that is not your job to do.
Yeah, that's white people's job to do with other white people, to engage in these conversations. And I think that the systemic perspective that all three of us represent here is really important, because I think a lot of white people, as I showed you with the Pew polls, 70% of surveyed white people think that racism is about individual prejudice and bigotry. So if they don't have hateful feelings in their heart for other people, then racism must not be such a big problem. And I think what's really important is to help people understand that that's not what it's about. That we could have, rainbows and unicorns, everybody feels love for everybody else, and that's actually not going to be enough. Because from the middle 50 years of the 20th century, the federal government subsidized $120 billion worth of loans that permitted the growth of the middle class, made homeownership possible. But because of redlining, 98% of that $120 billion went to white people, right? There's no way to undo that with diversity and inclusion trainings or with feeling love for one another. It has to be a matter of systemic change. And I think that can help to open up the ears of white people who may not feel, I mean, it's threatening in the sense that it would require white people to give up some kind of power. Although I think Dr. Canton's also right that it would actually lift up the society as a whole, right? And Black feminists tell us that if Black women are free, the rest of us will be too, right? We'll all be liberated. Black liberation means liberation for everybody, right? But I'm aware of a study. I can't remember the name of it, but some social psychologists who had an experiment with some white people. Half of them were boosted up before the conversation, and the others were just left alone. So the group that was boosted up, like they were told that they're worthy, right? That their egos were boosted, and then they were presented with evidence about institutional racism. Only the group that got that prior ego boost was able to see the institutional racism. So getting past that idea that you're telling people they're bad people if racism exists, is I think really important, opening up that conversation.
Thank you all. I want to go to a question that's been asked by two or three people in different ways. So I'm going to kind of combine these questions into one, and we'll start with Lance on this one, please. So as a dean, I must say personally, when I hear students report, as we heard from the videos that Della showed, that they have encountered discriminatory behavior by faculty, that is incredibly disheartening. And what's even more disheartening is that they report that there is not somewhere clear for them to go and not commiserate, but to actually take an action which they feel comfortable doing in order to address this. Lance, how would you structure that? And then let's go to Della and David after you talk about that a while.
I'm not sure that I have the answer to that, but I definitely see it as a problem. Because I teach race and racism every fall, it's a pretty regular occurrence that I get Black students and other students of color coming into my office hours, telling me about things that other professors did that were overtly racist, where students are experiencing racial abuse in classrooms, in class, and in other parts of the university. And I have struggled with, what do I do with that information? In some cases, I've offered to students, would you like me to contact that professor or that professor's department? Would you like me to try to facilitate or support you in some way? I've never done that, and I've never really known exactly what sort of resources are available for us at the university. I know that many of the students that I've talked to have followed up with the professors trying to get some kind of reconciliation, but often that's actually just exposed them to more trauma. And so many understandably just sort of shield themselves from it. So I would definitely be looking to you, Dean Richardson, but also to my colleagues for ideas about how to handle this, and what role can I play as a professor who hears these stories pretty often because of the subject matter of my teaching and research.
Mm-hmm. So Della, let me turn to you on the same question. What in your view would be the ideal? I mean, obviously the ideal is that it would never even happen, but when it does, purposefully or inadvertently, where can the student turn? What would that look like? How would that feel? What would it be?
Yeah, I'm having lots of different thoughts about this one. One takes me in the vein of thinking about the importance of, putting money behind and resources behind good consultants who do this work, right? Like, there are folks who are probably really well educated on figuring out different pathways to navigating these power dynamics when you're in a system that has tenure and things like that, and how to work out these pieces. But it takes like a committed effort to develop that. And so I don't have that. Another way that I'm thinking right now is I'm thinking about, like, those students should be able to turn to a community of support, whether that's in a department, whether that's friends and colleagues who look like them. And so I think we get to that point by being more open about talking about race in spaces, like normalizing that. And there's, I think, work to be done around normalizing having some of these difficult conversations, and work to be done around, I'm thinking about, like, what a system level intervention that trains our faculty and staff and our students on what accountability looks like, right? Like, people mess up. And I was recently on a call with someone where they were asking me to do something related to racism, and they did a microaggression in the conversation and just kind of rushed past it. And it's just like, I know you want to do the work and do better, but you don't know how to just, like, pause, take accountability, name it, say oops, hear about the harm you've caused. And so real intentional systematic work around giving these skills to folks that we really should have gotten a long time ago, but that we just don't have, because most folks, Black folks who experience harm, who are exposed to anti-Black racism, we don't have the power to cancel anybody. We need to still show up in that class, still show up in that department meeting, right? But so we want folks to be able to hear when they've caused harm, or to be able to notice when they've caused harm themselves, reflect, and do some work around it.
Right. David, do you have any thoughts?
Well, I think the challenge is there's no risk rewards, right? That when you have tenure, there's no punishment, there's no system. Now, the systems, when you protest it, you get a file, you get a letter, you get denied tenure, but that's the power of privilege, right? That even on the worst thing that I commit, I'm good to go. I'm not going to admit that, but I understand that. That's the problem. So just like the police, when these systems, there's no punishment, reward, a file, a letter, you can't get a grant or something, there's nothing to lose. And students understand that. They know that. That's why they're frustrated. And then the few that try to fight, you get frustrated, because even when you try to fight, then you become this person, then you don't get the grant. Oh, you're not collegial. You're not collegiality. Then those words start popping. You're unprofessional. You're angry. So what do? And that's why students get frustrated. So there's no mechanism to hold folks accountable, put a letter in their file, some sort of something that's saying this is a problem. But then we'll say free speech. So you get so many deals. But for those on the other side, there's not that many deals. You're walking on a slippery slope. You're one arrow from away. And once you get stigmatized, it's a wrap. You're persona non grata. You don't get deals, no opens the doors. then your life becomes miserable, become isolated, you're out of the power position, then you're frustrated. So we got to find a way to hold folks accountable from the slip to the extreme one. And that's the only way. And until you do that, that's how these systems continue.
Well, that what you described, David, is a process. But what I'm trying to get at is what is the most receptive place? Because I will tell you that there's a process there, and it's pretty clear that, you know, I as a dean have to have more conversations with leadership and with faculty about what that process is, so that they understand what the process is that does those things that you described. But what is the best place for a student to engage? Is it in my office, in the dean's offices around campus? Is it in the in the counseling and wellness center? Obviously, there are issues there. So I just would like to kind of get a sense of what the best place for them to go.
I think the IBC might be a place, you know, like in sports, we call it home field advantage. Maybe when students come to your office, the size, what it stands for, Turlington, but maybe come into IBC where the pick images of African American. This is quote unquote my home. So maybe in that space, you know, the student will feel a particular way. When coming to your office, they might feel a particular way, you know, coming to the dean, but you come to their space, you have to get up and walk across the street. It shows more some level of, okay, I'm coming out of my way, right? Rather than you go to the big dean's office, the whole space is disproportionately white, the pictures, the paintings, maybe that's a way that, okay, I see that administration is coming to my home base, IBC, and other institute areas where they usually do not come by unless it's some event. So that might be a way to, okay, I'm open, we'll see.
Thank you.
Richardson, I just wonder, are there other structures in place already at the university for dealing with other kinds of abuse? Like if a student experiences sexual harassment from a professor, for example, what are the channels for dealing with that? And is there some way to build on structures that already exist for also dealing with racist interactions?
Mm-hmm. So the let's talk about sexual harassment. Every chair should know, and faculty should know, that the chairs are responsible for intake in a unit when a student or a faculty member, or for that matter anyone, a staff member, reports sexual harassment. And it is the duty of leadership in departments to report that up to the dean's office, and we immediately report it to the university. So that is a well-established process. What I'm suggesting is, I don't know if that same process would feel comfortable.
Yeah, I'm seeing in the chat that those spaces already are not safe.
Okay, so we have time for a couple more questions. So one of the questions asked if one of you would just discuss the sort of compare and contrast of the concepts of equity versus equality. They're often used interchangeably, but are not.
I'll start. So education, we all have access to school, equality, right? By law, you must go to a public school, but we know they're all not equitable because the funding is based on property taxes. And there's a 1974 US Supreme Court case that says the federal government is not responsible to equalize that gap. 1974 case out of San Antonio. So equality is access to school. Equity is what? Making sure the resources. It's that simple, right? So the battle is for equity. Equality was 1965. Okay, I'm in, I can go here, I can go there as an individual, but equity is that all K through 5, K through 12 have regatta and AP classes and good lunches and trips to Spain and Ghana. equity. That's the difference. And again, if you provide equity, white people don't lose anything. I mean, that's the whole, there's no evidence, none. So I think we have to start from that premise. It's not a zero-sum game. It's a win-win game. Until you find me the evidence, right? There's no evidence. Well, I lost my job to a black guy. No, you weren't good enough. You were mediocre. So that doesn't work anymore.
So we have a question from one or two attendees. I'll try to paraphrase that relates to individuals in leadership positions. So I think one of the questions refers to department chairs. But obviously, in a leadership position, one needs to be prepared in many ways. So there's an entire bureaucracy of being a chair or director that David Canton is learning all about this year. But there's also a need to be prepared for the kinds of issues that arise. And we just talked a moment ago about sexual harassment as one of those. What are the things that people in leadership can do to further understand how to address these issues both within their units and how to appeal for the help they need above?
While folks chew on that question, I'm going to go back and two comments on prior questions. One is I'm thinking about Dave's question around the spaces, and Lanaya asked it really well, like what are the spaces that we could create? But I was thinking about some of being in spaces and thinking about folks with privilege and how they're able to leverage their identity and positionality to speak up about, bullies, people who are bullying and enacting racism. And so until we have that system level solution and in a better space, we need folks who can speak in the interim. And that question of what admin and deans and chairs and others can do is such a complicated one. There's a lot that needs to be done, and I think it's really tied to having like moving with a power analytic framework, like understanding how power is operating everywhere in this university and who's harmed by it, and making commitments that you stand on. I think that there's been a lot of work over the last several years, like different, I would love to do a study of all the demands that have been put out from Black folks over the last 20 years, right? If someone did a qualitative analysis of that thing, get to work on that. Like a blueprint has been laid out. And so it's just like a matter of going to that instead of going to this rote list of what we do when there's race-related problems, right? Like there's a certain set of activities that people run through instead of just like doing the things that have been outlined. So those are, and I think you have to have a deep understanding in order to do that work. And it takes a lot of digging and finding and piecing and patching and connecting with the right folks in order to really get an understanding of that. But that's what it makes me think about.
Thank you. Lance or David, any thoughts?
The only thing I would add, I think, the existing demands from UF Black Effort and from, the other demands that are out there seem really key to me. The only other thing that I would emphasize is that there need to be resources attached, that there needs to be a willingness to invest real money in systemic change. And, thinking about even some of these questions about like, where do students go, right? If they are not feeling welcome here, like, has the university invested any resources to make that happen? Yeah, just a willingness to put money down for real change.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's right. It would be, from a dean's perspective, asking chairs or leadership at any level within the college to do something without resources is something which has historically been done all too often in many, many areas. But in my experience in talking to folks in universities, it's quite often done to those who are put in charge and put into positions like diversity officers and the like. And that is clearly not a way forward for someone who's put into a position of responsibility. So I would like to bring us to a close here this evening and ask the audience to join me in giving a round of applause to our to our panel this evening. That will serve everyone. I'm sure that the audience has been large and very engaged this evening. We appreciate the participation and the thoughtful questions that were asked this evening. I would also like to once again thank our panelists for their hard work in preparing tonight's conversation and their work toward anti-racism. I didn't say this, but the structure of this and the content was very much guided by our panelists. And I thought they all have done a terrific job in educating all of us here this evening. We have our homework assignments. We will follow up. And I hope that this is only the first of many opportunities because I learned a lot here this evening. And I know that many of you did out there as well. And I appreciate all of the time that you've taken to be here. And again, to the panel, thank you for joining us this evening. Good night.
So much. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you all.